more than a decade, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were seen as the Gulf's power duo, aligned in strategy, coordinated in diplomacy, and often acting in concert across the region. From Yemen to energy policy, from post-Arab Spring transitions to regional security, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi appeared inseparable. But in late December 2025, something shifted. Yemen's UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council launched a major offensive in the eastern governorates of Hadramaut and Al-Mahra, advancing close to the Saudi border. Riyadh responded by striking facilities linked to the STC and intercepting a UAE weapons shipment in the port of Mukalla. Soon after, Abu Dhabi withdrew its remaining forces from Yemen. What followed was not just an escalation on the ground, but a diplomatic rupture between two of the Gulf's most powerful actors. And Yemen is only part of the story. From Sudan to Somalia, from the Red Sea to Washington, a broader geopolitical competition is unfolding, one that is drawing in other regional and global players, from Israel and Turkey to India and Pakistan. Not formal alliances, not fixed blocs, but a fluid and evolving reconfiguration of power. So how did we get here? And what does this rivalry mean for the wider Middle East? Welcome to Med Insights, the Med Mediterranean Dialogues podcast by ISPI, where we unpack the forces shaping the Middle East and North Africa and what they mean for global politics. I am Nicola Missaglia, and in this episode we explore how the rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE unfolded, what it reveals about shifting regional dynamics, and what consequences it may carry for the broader region.
And dangerous phase in US-Iran tensions.
Israel had said it would reopen Gaza's southern Rafah crossing with Egypt.
Protesters in Georgia take to the streets for the
an immediate ceasefire and deployment.
That's something that Syrians are trying to figure out right now.
Turkey's foreign minister says attacking Iran would not be the right.
In the Middle East, the Middle East crossed a threshold.
To understand how this transformation took place, I am joined by Firas Maksad, Managing Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Eurasia Group. Firas, what happened? What brought us from close partnership to this moment of open tensions?
I do agree that there was a period of time where you couldn't say Saudi Arabia without the UAE rolling off your tongue immediately after. It was Saudi and the UAE in Yemen, their various visions, MBS and MBZ working hand in hand. And that characterized the relationship for at least a period of 3 years. That started to change in 2019. The UAE chose to redeploy out of Yemen, in many ways kind of catching the Saudis by surprise. We also began to see the rise of competition, mostly economic competition between the two. Differences about oil pricing strategies within OPEC Plus, for example. The Saudis very much forward-leaning and wanting, the UAE, forward-leaning and wanting to pump more. The Saudis want to pull back and pump less. And so these differences started to emerge primarily in the business and economic realm. Both sides at the time sort of wanted very much to characterize this as virtuous competition, one that would perhaps compel both sides to remain on their toes, up their game, and that would help both economies, both countries do well and do better. Clearly not where we are today. So if we were allies and partners and moved into a phase of competition, I would say the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington this past November tilted the relationship into open rivalry.
Now, you have described a gradual shift from strategic alignment to economic competition, eventually to rivalry. But how central was the personal relationship between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed in both building and later complicating this partnership?
Both wield almost unchecked power in their countries. MBZ, from the get-go, made the right bet on Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, where the country was undergoing a generational transition in 2015 to 2017 time period when he was deputy crown prince and then crown prince. There was quite a bit of internal machinations within Riyadh about who will succeed the aging king. And in the MBN, Mohammed bin Nayef, who was crown prince, versus MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who was deputy crown prince, the UAE and MBZ very clearly leaned in favor of Mohammed bin Salman, and that was a winning bet. And that set those two countries, those two strong personalities, on a path where they were inseparable and where they were very close partners.
So it wasn't just a matter of policy coordination. It was also about two very powerful personalities shaping a regional moment. But personal chemistry can also generate friction. Was tension between the two leaders inevitable?
There was always kind of the seed of tensions between the two men. If we continue on kind of that personal aspect of or dimension of the relationship and what had happened, MBS was always vulnerable to criticism domestically within the kingdom from the more conservative Islamic circles, but even from within the royal family itself, those who had lost out in the transition on the royal family, that he was too close to MBZ. That he was taking his directions from the UAE. And the question always sort of reared its head of, why are we the first among the royals of the Arabian Peninsula, the Al Sauds, why are we taking directions from the Emiratis and the Al Nahyans and MBZ? And I would say that was kind of a talking point that left a mark that the opposition very much weaponized against MBS. And I think as Emirati influence grew around the region, because MBZ is also very ambitious, the differences in personality and the competition between the two men very much began to weigh on the relationship.
Now, while the rivalry has structural roots, the rupture followed very concrete developments on the ground, particularly in southern Yemen. To understand why the Eastern Offensive became such a critical turning point, I am joined by Eleonora Ardemagni, Senior Associate Fellow at ISPI. Eleonora, why was the STC's advance in Hadramaut and Al-Mahra perceived by Riyadh as a point of no return?
Well, the Saudi reaction to the offensive of the Emirati-backed Southern Transitional Council in eastern Yemen was mainly driven, in my view, by a national security imperative. Since the STC seized the north of Hadramaut Governorate, which borders with Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh considers this area strategic since it's a borderland. And it's also oil-rich, so it provides a lifeline to the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. Take also into account that the rest of the Yemeni-Saudi border is not totally controlled by Saudi-backed forces, since the Houthis, who are supported by Iran, are still holding parts of the northwestern frontier with the kingdom. And this explains why Hadramaut is so strategic to Riyadh. There are two other reasons, I think, pushed Saudi Arabia to react this way. The first is about a hierarchy in the GCC. The new southern state, the STC, was close to declare after the offensive, will have been a state primarily supported by the UAE. I don't think the Saudis are opposed to the idea of a southern Yemeni state in itself, although they certainly back now a united Yemen. The Saudis coexisted with the South Yemen state until 1990. What Riyadh can't accept now, I think, is to see Abu Dhabi as the main sponsor of a possible South of Yemen state bordering Saudi Arabia. Despite the UAE is a medium regional power, Saudi Arabia still wants to be acknowledged as the hegemonic force in the GCC, and not only through words, but also through deeds. The other reason is timing. As the STC escalation was occurring, Israel unilaterally recognized Somaliland, and for Riyadh, having two de facto new states in the Red Sea without its backing was a too high geopolitical and security risk.
But as both of you suggest, this crisis extends well beyond Yemen. Firas, Yemen may have triggered the escalation, but Sudan and the Red Sea corridor also seem central to this competition. Why?
We mentioned Yemen in the beginning of this conversation. Certainly, UAE taking over Yemen through their allies, the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, late December, was not something that the Saudis were willing to live with. Similarly, in Sudan, where the UAE is allegedly backing the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, Sudan, right across the Red Sea corridor from Saudi Arabia. I grew up, I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. I know that there's a very large Sudanese community. Destabilizing Sudan and dividing it has an impact both in the economic realm on the Red Sea corridor, which is a part of Vision 2030, but also on the geopolitics of the region and Saudi Arabia.
So in many ways, the Red Sea appears to concentrate the entire Saudi Emirati dynamic, economic ambition, security concerns, and competing partnerships.
Well, the Red Sea has become, in latest years, the crowded theater of regional and global powers competition. And Saudi Arabia, the UAE, also joined this competition with the same logic. I think there's an economic side of the story and a strategic one. The economic side is related to Riyadh and especially to Abu Dhabi's significant investments in Africa, from commercial ports, as you said, to energy and minerals, agriculture, and so on. Therefore, developing influence in the Red Sea region, and first in the Horn, which is the closest African area to the Arabian Peninsula, is a way to protect and at the same time to advance the post-oil interests of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the continent. The strategic side of the story is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have entrenched different, sometimes opposed partnerships in the Red Sea region, from Yemen to Somalia to Sudan, with the Emiratis prioritizing local actors controlling corridors and coastlines, as in the case of the STC in Yemen that I mentioned before. And the Saudis, on the contrary, strengthening the support to governments in fragmented states. Despite these agreements, Saudi Arabia and the UAE share, in my view, similar concerns when it comes to Red Sea security. Think to freedom of navigation, to counter piracy, counter smuggling, transnational cooperation between armed groups, and also the weakening of the Iranian influence in the Red Sea. And these shared concerns outnumber rivalries. Also because the security of the Red Sea is an integral part of Gulf security. So I believe that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have a common ground, a positive agenda for the Red Sea they can work on, obviously when the current crisis, de-escalates.
Firas, in a recent article in Foreign Policy you published at the end of January, you argued that the region may be reorganizing around two emerging coalitions, what you called an Abrahamic coalition and an Islamic one. This suggests, of course, something deeper than a bilateral dispute. Who belongs to these coalitions, and how do Saudi Arabia and the UAE differ in their respective visions of regional order?
I just came back from a trip to the GCC, and I have to tell you, every conversation with a senior official began with referencing this foreign policy article. Sometimes quite significant pushback against the idea of two emerging blocs. and the Abrahamic, essentially focused around Israel and the UAE, but also in partnership with Greece to the west in the Eastern Mediterranean, and India to the west, and then an Islamic coalition, which some prefer to sort of dub a status quo coalition. Traditional Muslim powers of the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, increasingly Egypt, tilting in that direction. I would say that I would characterize them less as alliances. These are still fluid coalitions, but very clearly there and likely to shape the dynamics of the region. And I think Israel is an important and integral part of the thinking and the calculus here, at least when it comes to the status quo powers. On the back end of October 7th and Hamas's terrible attack, countries have a choice and are increasingly making that choice, either to bandwagon, to use kind of realist theory terms here, either to bandwagon on Israeli power, which I would argue Israel not only restored its deterrence, but also has proven able to fight successfully on seven fronts. Don't take my word for it. Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't miss its opportunity to tell you that Israel is successfully fighting on 7 fronts. And Yemen, certainly against the Houthis. So there are countries in the region that are looking at this new emerging balance of power and deciding either to balance against Israel, because they've realized, certainly after the Israeli strike on Doha, Qatar, not too far from Riyadh at all, the first time in history that Israel attacks a GCC capital, that has set off alarm bells, and they have decided to try and balance against Israel because they've realized that Washington is not going to come to push back against the Israelis. And so this is when we saw Saudi Arabia and Pakistan formalize their long-standing security partnership in a mutual defense pact last September, but also draw closer to Turkey and bring in Egypt there. The UAE is in a different boat. The UAE is part of the Abrahamic coalition, part of the Abrahamic Accords, and in many ways is coordinating, not to use the word partnering, but coordinating with Israel in various theaters, including in Somaliland. And that is, again, referencing the structural element of what has emerged. I would like to emphasize they're not alliances, they are coalitions, they're fluid. And across the divide, there's an interest in these countries not to have exclusive relationships. So yes, the UAE is closer to India than it is to Pakistan, but it continues to value a relationship with Pakistan. Egypt is drawing closer to Saudi Arabia and Turkey, but continues to have financial interests from the UAE. So these are not exclusive alliances, but they are coalitions that are likely to shape the dynamics moving forward.
Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE remain deeply tied to the United States, especially with President Trump back in the White House. But Washington is unlikely to welcome a rift between the two key partners. Do you believe that the United States has both the leverage and the strategic coherence to manage this competition?
At the end of the day, Washington is the modern-day Rome. All the roads lead to Rome. And I think it will surface in future reporting that President Trump, in fact, played a key role in instigating the current rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, perhaps inadvertently. But this really was sparked by the visit of the Crown Prince to Washington, D.C. in November, in which he lobbied for sanctions against the RSF in Sudan. The RSF had launched a very bloody campaign, to say the least, in Al-Fashir, where thousands, perhaps more, had lost their lives. This was misrepresented as the Saudis would have you believe, and that the Crown Prince was in fact lobbying for sanctions against the UAE directly, rather than the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, which allegedly the UAE supports. That was a piece of information or misinformation, depending on who you believe, that was transmitted to the UAE directly by the President of the United States. And that set off the response that we then saw from the UAE or UAE allied militias in Yemen, where they took over the entirety of the Saudi-dominated part of the country and the chain of events that has followed. I'm not too sure that the President Trump fully understood the gravity of what was being communicated and the impact that that would have. But there's a clear U.S. role in having set this off. And there needs to be a U.S. role in mitigating these consequences and getting to conflict management between these two powerhouses in the Middle East, because the impact of what's playing out will not remain contained in the GCC. It will spill over to the Horn of Africa, as we've seen, to the Levant, all the areas where there's proxy competition between these two influential countries. You and I did discuss the personal aspect of this. I think that's a good place to start. The president maintains a solid relationship with both leaders, MBS in Saudi Arabia and MBZ in the UAE. He can very much invite the both of them to the White House or for a game of golf on his golf courses in Florida, and that can then begin the process of mitigating and conflict management in these various theaters. It doesn't mean that this is going to be resolved, because there is a very real structural geopolitical element that has to do with the ambitions of both countries. But at a minimum, this will lower the temperature and take us back to a more managed competition rather than open rivalry reality.
At the same time, we continue to witness a significant US military buildup in the Gulf and across the region. Firas, would a US or an Israeli strike on Iran change the balance between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, or would it deepen the divergence?
In some ways, it would further deepen this rivalry if, in fact, it is not mitigated and checked by Washington, because I argue that we're already in the post-Iranian Middle Eastern order. Iran has already been cut down to size in terms of its regional influence because its forward defense strategy, which relies heavily on the proxies, not only Hamas, but Hezbollah in Lebanon having been the crown jewel, the Assad regime in Syria being that crucial link to project power and influence into the Eastern Mediterranean. Those are all gone, or at least significantly diminished. And the further weakening of Iran is only going to tilt the balance of power further in favor of Israel. And that means that incentive that we were discussing to either balance against or bandwagon with Israel is only going to deepen as countries make their choices throughout the region. So taking Iran completely out of the equation by weakening it further, or perhaps even putting in motion a series of events that would threaten the regime's very survival, is only gonna further inflate and current chaos that we're seeing in the region. That, at a minimum, is perhaps in the short run. Obviously, longer term, there are very few actors in the region that are going to shed tears for the loss of a very damaging Iranian role that has fed instability throughout the region for decades. Yemen, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, Iraq. We can keep going. But in the shorter term, the weakening of Iran, I think, will only deepen the dynamic that we're currently witnessing.
Eleonora, how do you see it?
I believe Saudi Arabia and the UAE would freeze their standoff in case the US or Israel or both should attack Iran. The Saudis and the Emiratis are on the same page on Iran. They both consider diplomacy as the only viable path and Gulf security as the priority. So I'm sure they would temporarily de-escalate their rivalry. to focus on regional stability and national security in case of an attack against Iran.
Now, amid these tensions, 2026 is shaping up to be an important year for Europe and the Gulf. EU-GCC talks are back on the agenda on trade. Connectivity initiatives like IMEC are regaining. Eleonora, what risks does the Saudi Emirati rivalry pose for Europe? Could it slow multilateral cooperation and maybe push Gulf states to prioritize bilateral channels instead?
Yes, I agree with you. 2026 is a crucial year for EU-GCC cooperation, and the goal is advancing not only bilateral talks, such as partnership agreements, but also shaping a more strategic framework of multilateral cooperation. Think to the second EU-GCC summit that will be held in Riyadh by the end of the year, or to the possible free trade talks relaunch. I believe EU institutions and capitals should carefully manage the current political passage, since the main risk I see is a slowdown in EU-GCC multilateral cooperation because of the Saudi Emirati rift. And this could also affect other projects. IMEC, for instance, the India-Middle East Economic Corridor to Europe, has already to cope with the missing Saudi-Israeli normalization, and now also with the Saudi Emirati standoff. This could also be an occasion, I think, for making the corridor project even more inclusive at the Gulf level. The slowdown scenarios, for instance, including Oman in the corridor, since the geostrategic value of Oman would allow the corridor to bypass the choke point of the Hormuz Strait, connecting then to the UAE. The slowdown scenario, as I said, is something that Brussels should work to avoid as much as possible, stressing the shared challenges and interests Europe and the Gulf are facing, including the Saudis and the Emiratis, such as maritime security, the protection of critical infrastructures and undersea cables, counter-smuggling, terrorism, and so on. Look, when the Qatar crisis erupted in 2017, the blockade and the boycott on Doha by neighbors, the context was definitely different from the current one. Also, in terms of Europe-Gulf partnership, which wasn't so developed as it is now. But I'm confident that all actors are now fully aware that stakes are really high, and strengthening the cooperation is the only win-win horizon.
The rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is not just another diplomatic disagreement. It is part of a broader reordering of the Middle East, where old alignments are being tested, ambitions are becoming more explicit, and new fluid coalitions are beginning to take shape. This rivalry may intensify in some arenas and soften in others. It may be managed rather than resolved. But at its core lie deeper questions about leadership in the Gulf, security in the Red Sea, and the future balance of power in the region. Much will depend on external variables, the trajectory of US policy, Israel's regional posture, and the evolution of Iran's role. What is clear is that the consequences will not remain confined to the Gulf. We will continue to follow how this competition evolves and what it means for the wider Middle East and beyond. Editorial support and production by Sara Isabella Leikin, Luca Puzzangara, and Eleonora Marciani. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the Med Insights podcast on all major platforms. For more analysis and updates, visit med.isponline.it. Thank you for listening.